There are a lot of dangers to food safety out there, and one of the biggest is people. A lot of the things food handlers do can really put others at risk for foodborne illness, but like so much of this stuff, it's pretty easy to keep food safe by just using common sense. To make sure food handlers keep food safe, you're going to need to know how people can contaminate food, how and when to wash hands correctly, and the correct way to use gloves in the operation. Then we'll talk about the personal hygiene standards that you and your food handlers need to maintain, and what to do if an employee in your operation gets sick. Like I said, a lot of this is common sense. The problem is, if managers are not careful with the way they do their jobs and manage their staff, there could be big problems. Take a look.
Hepatitis A vaccinations were offered to thousands of guests who had visited a local casual dining restaurant in the Gulf Coast region of the United States. The vaccinations were made available by the local regulatory authority after a food handler at the restaurant tested positive for hepatitis A, exposing guests to the virus. The identified food handler was responsible for preparing and setting up items on the restaurant's salad bar. The food handler was excluded from work until approved to return by a physician and the regulatory authority. The local regulatory authority also worked with the restaurant to ensure it had all the correct processes in place to protect guests.
That was a huge mess. Just one person put thousands of others at risk. It was an absolute nightmare for the guests who were exposed to the virus, and it was also a nightmare for the staff, managers, and owners of the operation. And it could have been avoided pretty easily. The first step toward making sure something like this never happens to you is understanding how food handlers can contaminate food. Okay, let me ask you a question. If a healthy-looking person touches their face and then touches a salad they're making, could that make a guest sick? You got it. Even something as simple as touching your face can cause contamination and illness. So what are some other ways that people can spread pathogens? Well, food handlers can contaminate food when they're sneezing or coughing, and also when they have a wound that contains a pathogen. Plus, it may not seem obvious at first, but food handlers can also contaminate food when they have contact with a person who is sick. Another situation that can cause contamination happens when food handlers use the restroom and then forget to wash their hands. This even has its own extra gross name, the fecal-oral route of contamination. After using the restroom, people can have feces on their fingers. If a food handler touches food or a surface with soiled fingers, that can spread contamination. And if someone eats that contaminated food, illness can result. I know, I'm getting sick just thinking about it. Finally, food handlers can contaminate food when they have a foodborne illness or have symptoms like diarrhea, vomiting, or jaundice, which is a yellowing of the eyes or the skin. Now, with some illnesses, a person can infect others before they even show any symptoms. Take hepatitis A, for example. A person could spread hepatitis A for weeks before they show any symptoms. And norovirus can spread for days after symptoms have ended. With other illnesses, a person may infect other people for days or even months after symptoms have gone. And then you have what we call carriers. Carriers are people who carry pathogens and infect others without getting sick themselves. Let's talk a bit about actions that can contaminate food. Specifically, things that people do that can cause foodborne illness.
To avoid causing foodborne illness, you need to pay close attention to what you do with your hands. Take a look at these videos and then decide whether or not the actions you see can cause a foodborne illness. Here's the first one. What do you think? Could this cause a foodborne illness? Yep, that's right. Scratching your scalp or running your fingers through your hair and then touching food can contaminate the food. Don't do it. And don't let your staff do it either. Here's another one. Could this cause a foodborne illness? Nice. Sneezing or coughing into your hand and then touching food can cause a foodborne illness, so avoid doing this. Last video. Take a look. Well, do you see any problems? Nailed it. Don't wear or touch dirty clothing or aprons. It might feel natural to wipe your hands on your clothes or apron, but you can actually spread pathogens this way. Okay, that's a lot of ways that people can contaminate food. Don't worry, there's just a few more to discuss. Other actions that can contaminate food include rubbing an ear, wiping or touching your nose, touching a pimple or an infected wound, or spitting in the operation. Yuck.
As a manager, you're responsible for food safety in your operation, and a big part of this responsibility is managing the personal hygiene policies for your staff. So, what do you need to do to manage a personal hygiene program? Well, it starts with creating good personal hygiene policies, but you can't just set it and forget it. Periodically, managers will need to revise those policies because sometimes the laws and science around food safety get updated. Then, food handlers need to be trained on those policies, and they need to be retrained on them regularly. A big part of your job is also pretty obvious. Supervise the food safety practices in your operation at all times. And you're going to want to always model the correct behavior. Don't just tell people what to do. Make sure they can see you doing the right thing. Hand washing. It's the most important part of personal hygiene. Here's the thing. Hand washing seems like the most obvious thing in the world. I mean, we've all been doing it since we were kids, right? But the truth is that a lot of people don't know how to do it correctly. And some people may not understand when they need to wash their hands. Every day, we touch surfaces covered with microorganisms that we can't even see. And did you know that even healthy people can spread pathogens? They can. So, it's your job as a manager to train food handlers on how to wash hands correctly, and to make sure they do it.
Guess what? It's time to explore the exciting world of hand-washing sinks. Take a look at this picture. Is this person washing their hands correctly? Nice catch. This person is washing their hands in a food prep sink, which is not a good thing. Hands should only ever be washed in a sink designed for hand washing. Monitor your staff to make sure they do this. They should never wash their hands in sinks designated for food prep or dishwashing, or in sinks used for discarding wastewater.
Washing hands or prosthetic devices correctly is a 5-step process, and it should take at least 20 seconds. So, first, wet your hands and arms with warm running water. Then go ahead and apply the soap. Make sure there's enough soap to build up a good lather and follow the manufacturer's recommendations on how much to use. Once you've got your soap, scrub your hands and arms vigorously for 10 to 15 seconds. You're going to want to clean the fingertips, under fingernails, and between fingers. Once that's done, rinse your hands and arms thoroughly under warm running water. And finally, dry your hands and arms. You should use a hand dryer or a single-use paper towel for this. Now, if you're not careful, you can recontaminate your hands and arms pretty easily. So you might want to use that paper towel to turn off the faucet and open the door when leaving the restroom. Now, what happens if you see food handlers who aren't washing their hands correctly? Well, you need to take action. If they've touched food or food contact surfaces with unclean hands, dispose of the contaminated food. And clean and sanitize any utensils and equipment that may have been contaminated. And obviously, retrain or coach those food handlers who aren't washing their hands correctly. Knowing how to wash hands isn't all of it. You're also going to need to train your food handlers on when they need to wash their hands.
First off, always wash your hands before preparing food or working with clean equipment and utensils. Pretty obvious, right? You also need to wash them after using the restroom. Many foodborne illnesses are caused when food handlers forget to do this or do it incorrectly. Another obvious one is to wash hands after handling soiled items and before touching clean items. Other times you should wash your hands include after touching your body or clothing and after handling raw meat, poultry, or seafood. And hopefully, it's obvious that you should wash your hands after taking out garbage, sneezing or coughing, blowing your nose, or using a handkerchief or tissue. Did you know that you also need to wash them after eating, drinking, smoking, and chewing gum or tobacco? It's true. Additional times to wash your hands include after handling money, after handling chemicals that can make food unsafe, and after touching service or aquatic animals like a live lobster or a customer's adorable service dog. Also, hands should be washed after leaving the kitchen or food prep area, and then returning to it when changing tasks and before putting on single-use gloves. A lot of people don't think about this, but you also need to wash hands after touching electronic devices. Just think about how much dirt and grime is on the average cell phone. Yuck. Wow, that was a long list. When it comes right down to it, food handlers should pretty much try to wash their hands every single time they touch anything that could possibly contaminate them, including dirty equipment, work surfaces, and cloths.
Hand antiseptics, which most people call hand sanitizers, are pretty much everywhere these days. They can be a great way to reduce pathogens, but just like with washing your hands, it only works if you use them correctly. So here's a question. If you use hand antiseptic, do you also need to wash your hands? Yep, you're right. Hand antiseptics are liquids or gels that are used to lower the number of pathogens on skin, but they are no substitute for hand washing. In fact, you should only use hand antiseptic after hand washing, never in place of it. And after you've applied hand antiseptic, wait for it to dry before touching food or equipment. Oh, and if you're going to use hand antiseptic in your operation, you need to make sure that it complies with the standards from the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Hand washing is incredibly important to food safety, but you also need to make sure that your food handlers take good care of their hands to prevent the spread of pathogens. Question. Is it okay to handle food if you have long fingernails? No problem. This is new for a lot of people. You really shouldn't handle food if you have long fingernails. Let me explain why. It's hard to keep long fingernails clean, so food handlers should keep their nails short and clean. Nails should also be filed because long or ragged fingernails are hard to clean, may hold pathogens, and can break off into food, which is a physical contaminant and also pretty gross. How about nail polish? Can you wear it when handling food? Yep, you're right. Here's why. If you wear nail polish while handling food, it can hide dirt under your nails or flake off into the food.
Ew.
The same goes for false fingernails. They're hard to keep clean, and they can break off into food, which makes them a risk. Okay, so now that I've said all that, let me tell you that there is some good news for people who like to do their nails. False fingernails and nail polish can be worn if the food handler wears single-use gloves. Sorry if you're squeamish, but we need to talk about infected wounds, cuts, and boils. To keep food safe, how should you treat an infected wound on your hand? Yeah, that is part of it, but there's a little more to it. Let me show you.
If a wound, cut, or boil is infected, it has pus in it, which may contain harmful bacteria. So you should train your staff to always let you know if they have an open or draining wound or boil. You need to make sure they cover it correctly to prevent pathogens from contaminating food and food contact surfaces. For wounds on the hand, finger, or wrist, that means first using an impermeable cover, like a finger cot or bandage, that will prevent fluid from leaking out. Impermeable just means that liquid from the wound cannot pass through the cover. Then, you want to cover it with a single-use glove. Arm wounds must be covered completely with an impermeable cover that will prevent fluid from leaking out. Wounds on other parts of the body must be covered with a dry, durable, tight-fitting bandage.
Let's talk a little bit about gloves, specifically single-use gloves. They can help keep food safe by creating a barrier between hands and food. Now, when you're buying gloves, you should only get gloves that are approved for food service. And make sure they're made for single use, meaning you throw them away when you're done with your task. While it may seem like a good way to save money, single-use gloves should never be washed or rinsed and then reused. Secondly, a pair of gloves should fit like, well, a pair of gloves. If they're too tight, they can tear or rip pretty easily. And if they're too big, they won't stay on right. So provide a variety of sizes for your staff. Also, some people are sensitive to latex, so you might consider providing non-latex gloves. Now, if you're not careful when using gloves, the food you handle can become unsafe. Luckily, it's pretty easy to avoid problems. Here's how to use gloves.
Let staff know that gloves are not a replacement for correct hand washing. Not everyone knows this. Always wash hands before putting on gloves when starting a new task. You don't need to rewash them each time you change gloves as long as you are continuing to do the same task and your hands haven't become contaminated. So let's say you're forming burger patties and you need to remove your gloves. If you go back to forming those burger patties, you don't need to wash your hands again before putting on new gloves because you're continuing the same task. And while gloves may not be the easiest things to put on, they must be put on carefully. Hold them by the edge and avoid touching the glove as much as possible. And don't blow into them or roll them up, even if it would make it easier. And once they're on, give the gloves a quick check for rips or tears. Selecting the right size glove will help.
All right, here's a question for you. Do you know when to change single-use gloves? Let's say a prep cook has been wearing gloves to handle raw chicken and then needs to prep salads. Should she change her gloves? That's right. Food handlers should always change gloves after handling raw meat, seafood, or poultry, and before handling ready-to-eat food like the salad. There are other times when gloves should be changed. Let's take a look. Gloves should be changed as soon as they become dirty or torn. You also want to change them before beginning a different task, and if you get interrupted during a task, like to take a phone call or a text message. Also, change your gloves after handling raw meat, seafood, or poultry, and before handling ready-to-eat food. And finally, change into a fresh pair of gloves after 4 hours of continuous use. Gloves are an important tool to help keep food safe, but what about touching ready-to-eat food with your bare hands?
The truth is that food can become contaminated when it has been touched by bare hands. And this is particularly true when hands haven't been washed correctly, or when they have infected cuts or wounds. So the simple rule is, wear gloves when handling ready-to-eat food. Don't touch it with bare hands. This is particularly important if you primarily serve a high-risk population. Okay, now that we've said that, there are just a few exceptions. Bare hand contact is okay when washing produce, or when handling ready-to-eat ingredients for a dish that will be cooked to the correct internal temperature. If you're adding the ready-to-eat food as an ingredient to a dish that does not contain raw meat, seafood, or poultry, and the dish will be cooked to at least 145 degrees Fahrenheit, 63 degrees Celsius, then you aren't required to wear gloves. Adding cheese to pizza dough is an example of this. Similarly, if you're adding ready-to-eat food to a dish containing raw meat, seafood, or poultry, but that food will then be cooked to the required minimum temperature of those raw items, then you're okay to skip the gloves.
Moving on to everybody's favorite topic, personal cleanliness and hygiene. Wearing dirty clothes or neglecting to shower before you go into work probably isn't going to go over well with your guests. But that's not the only issue. There are real food safety concerns too. Keeping food safe means paying attention to hygiene, and the entire staff needs to know the basics.
Pathogens can be found on hair and skin, and there's a greater risk of these pathogens being transferred to food and food equipment if food handlers don't follow a personal hygiene program. So, make sure food handlers shower or bathe before work. Dirty clothing may also carry pathogens that can cause foodborne illnesses. These pathogens can be transferred from the clothing to the hands and to the food being prepared. Set up a dress code and make sure all staff members follow it. To keep hair out of food and food contact surfaces, food handlers should always wear a clean hat or other hair covering when prepping food or working in food prep areas. And they should not wear hair accessories or false eyelashes that can fall off into food and become a physical hazard. Basically, hair accessories should be limited to things that keep hair out of food. And if you have facial hair, doesn't matter if it's a neat goatee or a wild mountain man beard, you should also wear a beard restraint. Sure, it might not be the hippest fashion accessory, but it's better than getting someone sick. To prevent contamination, make sure that food handlers wear clean clothes at work daily. If they are wearing dirty uniforms, they need to change them. And if it's possible, change into work clothes after arriving at work. Street clothes and personal items should be stored in designated areas so they don't contaminate food or food contact surfaces and linens. This includes backpacks, jackets, electronic devices, keys, and personal medication. The same thing goes when it comes to work clothes like dirty aprons, chef coats, and other parts of the uniform. If dirty clothing is stored at work, it must be kept away from food and food prep areas. So, put these items in non-absorbent containers or washable laundry bags. And finally, always remove aprons and store them correctly when leaving food prep areas. For example, wearing an apron when taking out garbage or using the restroom is a big no-no. And while we're on the subject of aprons, make sure that food handlers know to never wipe their hands on their aprons. It can contaminate their hands.
Very good. Let's take a look at something people often overlook when it comes to food safety: jewelry. A lot of people don't know this, but jewelry can contain bacteria or other pathogens. Take a look at a watch or a ring sometime, and you probably see a lot of little crevices where stuff can accumulate. Also, jewelry can just fall off into food, so food handlers should remove any jewelry from hands and arms and store it safely before prepping food or working around food prep areas. Things like bracelets, medical bracelets, watches, and rings, except for plain band rings, should be removed. Now, there's always a risk that jewelry can fall into food and become a physical contaminant. So, some managers require food handlers to remove other types of jewelry like necklaces, earrings, and facial jewelry. That said, servers can wear jewelry if allowed by company policy.
Okay, it's quiz time. Take a look at these two people and select the one that's dressed correctly. Yep, it's all about the hat here. His customers won't have to worry about hair or other pathogens in their food. How about these two? Which one is dressed correctly? Good job. No problem here. The guy, however, forgot to take off his watch. Last one. Who's dressed correctly for a trip to the bathroom? Nice. She remembered to remove her apron before heading to the restroom.
Time to talk about what's in your mouth. Eating, drinking, smoking, and chewing gum or tobacco can make food unsafe if you're not careful. How so? It's probably not surprising to learn that saliva contains pathogens that can cause foodborne illness. In fact, small droplets can contain thousands of pathogens. I know, it's probably starting to seem like everything can spread foodborne illness. Eating, drinking, smoking, and chewing gum or tobacco can transfer pathogens to hands or directly to food being handled. Grossed out yet? Staff should only eat, drink, smoke, and chew gum or tobacco in designated areas. These things should never be done when working in areas used to clean utensils and equipment, when prepping or serving food, or when working in food prep areas. Now everyone gets thirsty, right? Well, if staff members are going to drink in food or food prep areas, they should use a container with a sip top or with a lid and a straw. And containers should always be handled carefully to avoid contaminating hands, the container, and any exposed food, utensils, or equipment. When sick people come to work and handle food, it can cause problems. That's why it's so important that you talk to your staff about what to do when they're feeling sick.
Tell your staff that they need to let you know when they're sick. This even includes new staff who haven't started working yet. In fact, your regulatory authority may ask to see proof that you've done this. There are a few ways you can show this proof. One option is to present signed statements from all the staff showing that they've agreed to report illness. Or you can provide documentation showing staff have completed training, including training on the importance of reporting illness. And finally, you can post signs or provide pocket cards that remind staff to notify managers when they're sick. The point of all this is to make sure staff members know to report illness before they come to work. And they need to let you know right away if they get sick while they are working. Depending on the illness, employees may need to be excluded or restricted from work. What does that mean? Well, when we say restrict, that means the sick food handler should be restricted from working with exposed food, utensils, or equipment. Exclude means pretty much what it sounds like. For certain illnesses, an employee may need to be excluded from coming into work while sick. They should stay out of the operation. Now, whether an employee should be excluded or restricted depends on their illness.
Let's see what you already know. This employee woke up this morning with a fever and a sore throat. Do they need to tell a manager? Yep, a manager should be told. Now let's take a look at what the manager needs to do. If a food handler has a sore throat and fever at the same time, then they should be restricted from working with or around exposed food, utensils, or equipment. But it's still okay for them to come to work as long as they avoid those things unless they primarily serve a high-risk population. If that's the case, then they should be excluded from the operation. They shouldn't return to the operation or food handling duties until they get a written release from a medical practitioner. Let's try another. This employee woke up with a very stiff neck. Do they need to tell the manager? That's right. From a food safety perspective, they aren't required to tell their manager about a stiff neck. This employee has a wound on their hand and it's draining fluid. It looks infected. Do they need to tell the manager? Yes, they do. Employees should tell managers if they have an infected wound or boil unless it's properly covered. Staff members with these conditions should be restricted from working with exposed food, utensils, and equipment. Okay, how about this one? This employee has a persistent cough and runny nose, and it doesn't seem to be going away. Do they need to tell the manager? You got it, and the manager needs to take action. Believe it or not, a persistent sneeze, cough, or runny nose that causes discharge from the eyes, nose, or mouth is a hazard to food safety. Staff members with these conditions should be restricted from working with exposed food, utensils, and equipment. Here's the next one. This employee caught something from a family member and has been vomiting all morning. Do they need to tell a manager? Yes, they do. Now, here's what the manager needs to do. If a food handler has vomiting or diarrhea from an infectious condition, then the manager needs to exclude that person from the operation. The employee shouldn't return to work until they either get a written release from a medical practitioner or until they have had no symptoms for at least 24 hours. This morning, this employee noticed that the white part of his eyes looked kind of yellowish. Does he need to tell the manager? Yes, he absolutely does. A yellowing of the eyes or skin is called jaundice, and it's a big deal. Let's take a look at what the manager should do next. A food handler who has had jaundice for 7 days or less should be excluded from the operation, and any food handler with jaundice should be reported to the local regulatory authority. Before returning to work, the individual needs to get a written release from a medical practitioner and approval from the local regulatory authority. Like I said, it's a big deal. Last one. This food handler has been diagnosed with Salmonella typhi. Should the manager know about this? You bet the manager should know about this. Now let's see what the manager needs to do about the situation. A food handler who has been diagnosed with Salmonella typhi or hepatitis A must inform their manager, and they should be excluded from the operation. Now, if a food handler has vomiting or diarrhea, and they've been diagnosed with norovirus, Shigella, non-typhoidal Salmonella, or Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, STEC, then it's the same story. The food handler must inform their manager, and they should be excluded from the operation. Now, some food handlers diagnosed with an illness may not show any symptoms, or their symptoms may have ended. Management should work with a medical practitioner and the local regulatory authority to figure out if they should be excluded from the operation or restricted from working with exposed food, utensils, and equipment. They can help determine when the person can return to the operation and/or carry out their regular food handling duties.
Now, all of this information is a general guide. If you have a sick food handler, your local regulatory authority and a medical practitioner can help you determine the right course of action. As a manager, you need to pay attention to the health of your staff. That means keeping a sharp eye out for things like persistent nasal discharge and sneezing, cold sweats or chills indicating a fever, and yellowing of the skin, eyes, or nails. Also, pay attention to things like employees who are vomiting or making excessive trips to the bathroom.
Obviously, if you have a food handler with an infectious condition in your operation, it's a big deal, and you have a responsibility to report this.
Let your local regulatory authority know if a food handler in your operation has been diagnosed with non-typhoidal salmonella. And you should also let your local regulatory authority know if a food handler in your operation has been diagnosed or lives with someone who has been diagnosed with norovirus, hepatitis A, Shigella species, Shiga toxin-producing E. coli, or STEC, or Salmonella typhi.
Whew, that was a lot of information, but I've got some good news. We're nearly there. We've just got a few questions to answer, and we're done with this module.
Let's start by seeing what you remember about how people can contaminate food. Which activity is most likely to contaminate hands? Yes, running fingers through hair can definitely contaminate hands. Nice job. To correctly wash hands, how long should you scrub with soap? That's right. When you wash your hands, you need to scrub them for 10 to 15 seconds to really get them clean. When must a food handler wear single-use gloves? You got it. Food handlers should always wear single-use gloves when touching ready-to-eat food. Where should street clothes and personal electronic devices be stored? Yep, that's it. To prevent contamination, these items should be stored away from food and food prep surfaces. Which foodborne illness in a food handler must be reported to the local regulatory authority? That's right. If a food handler in your operation has norovirus, you should report it to the local regulatory authority. Nice job.